Okay, welcome everybody. It's a few minutes after 1:30, but I want to go ahead and get started. They've left a baseball cap up here, so I guess that's part of our topic is that we have to wear the baseball hat for the. Okay, that's a dumb joke, but I am extremely, extremely happy that this conference is happening, and I'm very happy to introduce this next panel, which is called Lesbian and Queer Genres of Underclass Intimacy. Okay, our first speaker is Abby Cordwell, who is in English at the University of Mississippi, and so I'm going to turn it over to Abby to get us started.
Okay, hi everyone. So my paper is called Blue Collar Butches, Beebo, Brinker, and Labor as Self-Creation. So in the introduction to the 2002 Cleese Press reprint of her 1959 lesbian pulp book, I'm a Woman, Anne Bannon describes the archetypal butch figure as strong, tough, heroic, romantic. Implicit in this description is a gesture to the blue-collar working conditions that shaped not only broad conceptions of what Bannon recounts as the quote, big, bold, handsome, quintessential 1950s boucaneur butch, but specifically Bannon's central butch figure, Betty Jean Beebo Brinker. Beebo, who works throughout the novel as a self-described lift jockey, is portrayed as entering this line of work because it allowed her not to have to, quote, wear a skirt. This paper aims to trace how female masculinity is constructed in this novel through a specifically classed lens, where Beebo becomes intelligible as a butch figure through the material traces of her labor, and thus argues that both the gendered embodiment and erotic framing of the butch figure in I'm a Woman is inextricably tied to labor and class interactions. In other words, I argue that the novel frames butch masculinity and eroticism as specifically emerging through class and being produced by blue-collar forms of labor. As such, rather than the conventional framing of the working-class butch as a subject who is doubly marginalized by class exploitation as well as gender deviance, I argue that the novel instead gestures towards a specific mode of butch identity and desire which is linked to labor as an act of self-creation. In her 1992 essay of Catamites and Kings, Gail Rubin defines butch as a category of lesbian gender that is constituted through the deployment and manipulation of masculine gender codes and symbols. A popular image, she writes, of the culturally conceived butch is one where, quote, a butch always has very short hair, wears a leather jacket, rides a Harley, and works construction. It is clear that the identity category of butch has long been entangled with conceptions of working-class masculinity, or, as Rubin writes, semiotically related to a long lineage of images of young, rebellious, sexy, white, working-class masculinity. And the literary representation of the butch as a working-class figure became shaped through mid-century lesbian pulp novels, of which Bannon's Beebo Brinker series was undeniably a major cultural force. Michelle Abate writes, for example, that with the Beebo Brinker series receiving more commercial success, critical attention, and cultural longevity than any other lesbian pulp novels, Christopher Nealon has aptly noted that Bannon's work is now firmly ensconced as the premier fictional representation of lesbian life in the 50s and 60s. Beebo herself emerged out of what Bannon describes as the hostile era of McCarthyism and rigid male-female role-playing. Abate goes on to describe butchness as a post-war phenomenon, a complex code of personal style, sexual role-play, and physical and emotional self-presentation, which emerged among working-class lesbians in general and those involved in the urban bar scene in particular in the years following the end of World War II. In Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, Lillian Faderman articulates the linkage between working-class butchness and bar culture, writing that bars were a particular relief for many butch working-class women because it was only there that they could dress right, in pants. There were few jobs in the 1950s where women might wear pants, and still not many public places they could go and not be somewhat conspicuous. It is no coincidence, then, that I'm a Woman features Greenwich Gay Bar, The Cellar, as an important space in mediating the relationship between Beebo and Laura, as the gay bar scene became central to the production of a butch identity in the 50s and 60s. In Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, Elizabeth Kennedy and Madeline Davis claim that butch femme roles were the key structure for organizing against heterosexual dominance, and therefore cannot be viewed simply as an imitation of heterosexual sexist society. Through roles, lesbians began to carve out a public world of their own and developed unique forms for women's sexual love of women. Importantly, Kennedy and Davis situate these roles as based in the interconnections of resistance, appearance, and eroticism, illustrating butch femme roles as constituting a, quote, deeply satisfying erotic system that became central to lesbian desire. In Female Masculinity, Jack Halberstam opens this claim up more broadly, arguing that the butch figure is just one of many multiple forms of female masculinity, with female masculinity then functioning as a distinct category in its own right, not an imitative or derivative form of white middle-class maleness, but rather its own multiple form that affords us a glimpse of how masculinity is constructed as masculinity. As he writes, women have made their own unique contributions to what we call modern masculinity, and what we recognize as female masculinity is actually a multiplicity of masculinities. Within this understanding of the butch-femme relationship and female masculinity as both multiple and discrete from heterosexual formations, the paper argues that the construction of Beebo's butch identity in I'm a Woman is specifically produced through the act of labor and class identifications. The enduring legacy and popularity of the Beebo Brinker series then situates this formation of butch identity within a broader trajectory of lesbian identity in which labor and cross-class desire have played a constitutive role. In chapter 13 of I Am a Woman, the following exchange takes place between Laura Landon, Beebo's love interest, and Jack Mann, a mutual friend. What does she do? Laura asks rather shyly. Who? Beebo? She must get money somewhere. She has to pay rent like everybody else. She runs an elevator in the Grub building. They think she's a boy. My God, an elevator. It seemed wrong, even ludicrous. Beebo had too much between her ears to fritter her youth away running an elevator. What does she do that for? She doesn't have to wear a skirt. As this exchange between Jack and Laura makes clear, it is Beebo's choice to work as an elevator operator, one that specifically creates the material conditions through which her masculinity is perceived. Importantly, Beebo does not seem to take this job out of economic necessity, but because it provides a space in which she does not have to engage in conventional markers of femininity, and she is therefore able to create a gendered presentation that would not be permissible in conventional white-collar labor settings. Her work becomes, therefore, a site of deliberate self-creation, a means through which she is able to purposefully claim masculinity rather than merely approximating it. In this specific environment, Beebo's masculinity is not only presented, but externally affirmed, as her co-workers and ostensibly customers as well, quote, think she's a boy. This repeated recognition of Beebo as a boy, crucially different to Laura's characterization of Beebo as like a young boy of 14, with her smooth skin and deep blue eyes, makes clear how labor structures the social readability of her masculinity. Unlike Laura, who's given the context of the gay bar to read Beebo's gender presentation, Beebo's co-workers do not metaphorize her as masculine, but read her as male within the function of her labor. Here, Rubin's definition of butch identity as a category of lesbian gender that is constituted through the deployment and manipulation of masculine gender codes and symbols is recalled, as she points to a form of masculinity which is mediated through recognition and perception. Beebo's masculinity becomes intelligible through these repeated acts of recognition, as her labor offers her the masculine codes that people are able to perceive. Her labor then creates the possible conditions for her masculinity, as it is through her labor that Beebo acquires both the physical markers of masculinity, i.e. a space in which she is compelled to wear men's clothing, and the social readings, i.e. being recognized in public as a male figure, that permit her access to a masculine position otherwise unavailable to her. In this way, her butchness emerges through her class position, as it is her blue-collar labor which specifically provides the material and perceptual frameworks through which her masculinity is able to become visible. It is Laura's discomfort with Beebo's work that leads to the dissolution of their brief relationship. After she prods Beebo as to why she works as an elevator operator, and Beebo responds somewhat mockingly, Laura, in an attempt to hurt Beebo, says, "You're ridiculous. You're a little girl trying to be a little boy, and you run an elevator for the privilege. Grow up, Beebo. You'll never be a little boy, or a big boy. You just haven't got what it takes. Not all the elevators in the world can make a boy of you. You can wear pants till you're blue in the face, and it won't change what's underneath." As Laura attacks Beebo's masculinity through the framing of not being able to change what's underneath, there exists a dubiety as to whether she's referring to Beebo's lack of male anatomy or to her unwillingness to engage in a job which Laura would consider more aligned with her social status. The ambiguity of the statement, however, becomes diminished when Laura repeats it to another elevator operator. She glared at him, violently offended by his manner, his uniform, his question. "Don't you know those pants won't make a man of you?" she exclaimed acidly. Given that Laura does not differentiate her critique of masculinity between Beebo and the male elevator operator, her judgment is then seemingly rooted in the blue-collar work of the elevator operator rather than Beebo's manifestation of female masculinity. Laura's criticism then seems to be less a rejection of Beebo's masculinity itself and more a discomfort with the way that her work situates that masculinity in a context that Laura sees as beneath Beebo's intelligence. Through this, she links Beebo's masculinity directly with her blue-collar labor. Importantly, this moment is the only point in the novel where Laura explicitly challenges Beebo's masculinity. Outside of this encounter, Laura consistently otherwise accepts Beebo's masculinity as natural and, crucially, sexually attractive. The only time, therefore, in which Laura critiques Beebo's masculinity is when she is launching an attack on Beebo's perceived transgression of social class, not her transgression of gender roles. In other words, Laura's critique targets the class context in which Beebo performs her masculinity, rather than the masculinity itself. This both illustrates the inseparability of labor from the construction of Beebo's masculinity and the way in which class shapes the reception of that masculinity. Furthermore, the narrative structure of Beebo and Laura's relationship is innately tied to labor and economic exchange. While Laura is employed, her and Beebo's relationship is never fully established, and it is only after Laura loses her job that she and Beebo profess their love for one another and are able to move forward in their relationship. There is an implication here that it is specifically the conditions of employment that directly shape the possibilities for intimacy. For example, the second instance in which the two engage in sexual activity is marked by discussion of work. Beebo attempts to persuade Laura to stay with her, while Laura insists she has to go to work, stating, "It was suddenly important in a new way too. It meant distance between her and Beebo. She was vaguely afraid that Beebo was strong enough to overwhelm her, to dominate her life. She needed something else to keep her perspective, her independence." Here, the invocation of work is used as a barrier to intimacy between the two, and a way to reassert class differences. Laura's secretarial job anchors her to a set of white-collar obligations, which demand self-containment and an adherence to normative femininity, all qualities which inhibit her willingness to fully engage in a relationship with Beebo. In contrast, Beebo's blue-collar labor positions her outside these expectations and locates her in the masculinized role which facilitates their erotic encounters. When Laura loses her job, this hierarchy collapses, allowing a relationship that had previously been inhibited by this social difference to finally be realized. In this way, the novel frames labor as the medium through which desire is generated and through which the social hierarchy can be both produced and collapsed within the relationship. Furthermore, acts of repayment is what initially establishes the relationship between the two. Their first meaningful interaction revolves around a dime that Beebo gives to Laura, which prompts Laura to seek Beebo out to settle the debt. The act of Beebo giving the dime to Laura, "Here's a dime, sweetheart, call me sometime," then also functions as a way for the two to begin an intimate relationship. And although Laura does not take her up on that specific invitation, it is this dime that compels Laura to try and find Beebo. "I owe you a dime, Beebo. There it is. Thanks for the picture. Next time, don't waste your money." This exchange is working on multiple levels, where on the one hand, this act of giving the dime positions Beebo as a masculine figure by granting her control over the terms of their interaction. She initiates the encounter and creates a dynamic in which Laura will likely feel compelled to reciprocate. On another level, the dime functions as a symbol through which desire is being communicated. It is the back-and-forth exchange of the dime that implicitly leads to Beebo and Laura's first erotic encounter. It becomes clear that throughout the narrative, labor and economic transactions frame the interactions between the two women, and also provide the context through which they are able to engage in intimacy. The dime metaphorizes this. Through the exchange of the dime, we see how the conditions of Beebo's labor, in other words, her access to money and her distinctive construction of masculinity, directly allow for the possibility of the erotic encounter. The narrative thus emphasizes how both gender construction and intimacy are produced through specifically class-based labor. It is through her labor that Beebo's masculine identity is produced, and which establishes the conditions for desire in the novel. In her essay, Was It Right to Love Her Brother's Wife So Passionately?, Yvonne Keller writes that lesbian pulp novels were readily available to women of this generation in dizzying quantities and at locations close to home, and that lesbian pulps were not only cheap, they were readily available in the corner drugstore or newsstand. This mass-market circulation simultaneously broadened the readership of these lesbian narratives while situating books like the Beebo Brinker series within a print industry whose production and circulation is intrinsically tied to class. This material framing works to contextualize why the novel might be so preoccupied with labor and the erotics of class interactions. The text then emerges from an environment in which the production and representation of lesbian identity itself is mediated through the conditions of labor. It is within this same understanding of the specifically classed aspects of production that the novel locates its formation of female masculinity. This paper has then argued that Beebo's masculinity can be understood as not simply a replication of heterosexual codes, but historically specific construction produced through the conditions of her blue-collar labor. And through this, Bannon points for butchness as a category of lesbian gender which is articulated through class, as well as masculine gender codes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. Our next speaker is S. Dowdy, who is in political science at the CUNY Graduate Center. So come on up.
Thank you so much to everyone for being here, to my co-panelists, and to the organizers of this conference. It's such an honor to be here, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all. The title of my paper today is Andrea Long Chu and the Revival of Lesbian Feminist Polemic. As the trans feminist collective Autogynephiles Anonymous recently announced in a post on Substack, "Dear fellow lesbians, I am restarting the sex wars." To the chronically online among us, this may not be a surprise. I think that's probably all of us. But to catch the rest of you up to speed, that's what's happening. This kind of provocation, no matter how one may feel about it, whether you agree with it or not, has a long and, I argue, crucially important and class-inflected legacy in lesbian feminist culture and history. Monique Wittig's notorious claim that lesbians are not women, Zoe Leonard's satirical poem/manifesto, "I Want a Dyke for President," Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools, Andrea Dworkin's entire body of work, to name a few, are routinely cited as canonical moments of feminist writing and of feminist polemic in particular. But each of these interventions is also unmistakably queer and in particular lesbian, in both subject matter and authorship. And while these texts are among the most visible or widely known, they are far from exhaustive. And many other such provocations, some of which may not take written form, remain obscured. Regardless, it is somewhat surprising that there is no existing theory of lesbian feminist polemic. Scholarly treatments of polemic have largely suffered from an androcentric focus, and existing feminist theorizations have failed to meaningfully account for the seductive excesses of polemic. I ask, what insights might theorizing polemic as such bear? How has a failure of attention towards its various excesses informed the misreading of feminist polemic? What political work does polemic do, and what is its relationship to power? These questions animate my project, as does my suspicion that since the libidinal figures prominently in fascist imagery, a reading of polemic that appreciates its location at the critical edge of sexuality and politics is urgently needed. But today in particular, I'm interested in thinking with you all about how the formation, circulation, and reception of lesbian feminist polemic is deeply conditioned by class relations. I'm so sorry, could someone possibly get me some water? Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Oh my gosh. Okay, thank you. An emerging body of literature challenges the wholesale evaluation of political lesbianism and lesbian separatism as unambiguous failures. Similarly, I hope to reevaluate an under-examined and over-maligned lesbian feminist polemic in order to excavate its critical edges. In doing so, I'm informed by an ambivalent approach that seeks, but will perhaps fail, to resist the redemptive impulse to authorize my own political desires. I situate my intervention amidst this body of literature, as well as in response to queer theory's fascination with failure and with antisociality. If it is true, as Leo Bassani contends, that queer theory pastes over the distinction between erotics and politics, I seek to dwell at this edge in order to understand its generative friction. This project is grounded in the impossibilities, failures, and negativities with which lesbian feminism is saddled. And it is my hope that these may serve as resources in order to better understand the political content and utility. I root this consideration in two interlocutors, both named Andrea. And as you might have guessed from the title of the talk, one of them is Andrea Long Chu, and the other is Andrea Dworkin. This project started with a desire to understand why I felt so differently when I read Andrea Longshue as compared to how I felt when I read Andrea Dworkin. But as time has gone on, the project has moved away from the Andreas, but for the purposes of today's conversation, I return to them and to the increasingly complex feelings I have about them. But first, what is polemic? Like obscenity, you know it when you see it. It rubs you the wrong way, even and perhaps especially if you agree with it. The Oxford English Dictionary defines polemic as of the nature of exhibiting, given to, or relating to dispute or controversy. Contentious, disputatious, combative. It derives from the French polemique, meaning disputatious, combative. I apologize, that was in the previous sentence. And from the Greek polemikos, warlike or hostile. So polemic is a mark of militancy and of aggression within the context of disagreement. But polemic is also, per theorists including Catherine Flannery and Aaron J. Rand, a refusal of traditional forms of argumentation and a strategic violation of rhetorical norms. The conversation as it stands is limited by the fact that language is a tool of the powers that be, and as Audre Lorde famously and polemically argued, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So marginalized people have often resorted to other forms of communication. The popular association with polemic is decidedly negative, and not just because it is perceived to be aggressive or antisocial, which it certainly is, but also because it is considered, per Jonathan Crew, to be a cheap, often trivial substitute for real intellectual production. Because polemic is ultimately and disturbingly inseparable from belligerence and violence more broadly, has no place in an academy that in the post-Vietnam War era increasingly presupposes some level of respectful engagement with or even continuing dependency on the object of critique. And yet, it cannot be true that there is no room for polemic's provocations in the university, as polemic has skyrocketed many an academic to success and renown, and its interventions have created and defined entire disciplines. Our historicizations, Michael Warner notes, convince us that these dangerous intensities do not belong to our world. This disavowal is instructive. Polemic represents a dangerous intensity, the excess of critique and of the reason which it deploys. The excess of polemic entails its more aggressive distanciation from the object of its critique, or as Jayne Gallup puts it, polemical reading is literally critical with a vengeance. This is not to say that polemic is immune to cooptation. The commodification of certain kinds of polemic has been assimilated rather seamlessly into contemporary news and entertainment. This is both polemic's strength and weakness, how irresistibly entertaining it can be. But not all polemic is a pleasure to read. The affective resonance of polemic is often abrasive, or perhaps that is to say its pleasures are more complex. And here I must, of course, return to Andrea Dworkin. Dworkin used to, and often still does, rub me the wrong way. But I've softened to her a little bit. I've heard and resonated with anecdotes from people I know who teach Dworkin to their students, who are kind of put off at first by her perceived or projected brashness when reading her writing, but then later shocked to find out when watching, video or audio recordings of her, how soft-spoken she is. This kind of miasma of off-putting dykiness that seems to cohere around Dworkin is undoubtedly class-inflected. But I do not say this in an effort to redeem or recuperate her, as some have recently sought to. She was a complex figure, far more sympathetic to Zionism, transphobia, anti-pornography censorship than I'm comfortable with. And she was also kind of weird about race, as white feminists of that era in particular sometimes were. And in the present day, Dworkin's arguments and ideas are just as often taken up by the right, by those on the left who seek to claw her back from them. And yet, she kind of has this seductive appeal, which some people argue is her danger. There is a brutal clarity to her writing, a ruthless politicality, like a kind of forcefulness that I cannot help but admire. Dawkins aspired, in her own words, to write a prose more terrifying than rape, more abject than torture, more insistent and destabilizing than battery. Her writing mirrors the violence to which it responds and the inherent interrelation of sex and violence, which is often misread as a characterization of all sex as rape. But it also recognizes that freedom itself, as well as the battle for it, is necessarily agonizing and violent. Aaron J. Rand identifies indeterminacy of outcomes as the defining feature, and indeed the site of queerness of polemic. This indeterminacy occupies the excesses and risks of the indeterminacy of all language. But the risk of polemic's aggression lies in part in its relationship to dependency. Dawkins crucially operated from a place of profound precarity. Until her lavender marriage later in life with John Stoltenberg, Dawkins was often in a desperate situation, doing sex work, smuggling drugs, and various other odd jobs to survive, including writing and performing incendiary speeches. Nobody really wanted to hear the poetry or the fiction that she wrote. Despite her infamy, and even with her co-conspirator and co-author Catherine McKinnon's support, she was not able to secure an adjunct teaching position. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the warning. Okay, I'm close to the end, so it's good. So back to the other Andrea as we begin to close. Andrea Long Choose Females is one of my favorite books, and to those of you who have not already read it, I will not spoil it for you. Her provocations therein and elsewhere landed her a rare full-time position as a book critic at the New York Magazine, allowing her escape from the simultaneous source of prestige and precarity that is the university, of which there has been much discussion today. As Andrea Long Chu highlights in her reading of Valerie Solanas, who is most commonly known for shooting Andy Warhol, highlights the force of desire that propels Solanas' work. And I quote, "Readers would be confronted by desire, not truth, peeking out of the text like a tattoo from a sleeve, a reminder of the flesh behind every idea." Analogizing her approach to persuasion, Longtrue expresses that the only person worth flirting with is somebody who is already attracted to you. Her approach to writing then is to assume that you will agree and instead spend her time writing, creating a richly imagined space in which you can assume the subjectivity necessary to bear the opinion you already have. The flirtatious excesses of Longchu's approach make clear that long overlooked element of lesbian feminist polemic, the playful erotics of its violence, presumed to be beyond the stylistic reaches of their non-elite, non-male authors. As the US's constitutive authoritarianism becomes more overt and its precarities heighten and proliferate, such a reading becomes increasingly urgent. If we are to take Tony Cade Bambara's imperative to make revolution irresistible seriously, then we need an account of lesbian feminist polemic that takes seriously its critical edges and engages the possibilities of its indeterminate, playful, aggressive erotics. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, S. Our next speaker is Ian Jayne, who actually just defended dissertation in English at University of Virginia, so congratulations, Ian, and welcome to the podium.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My paper is called Dreaming of Other Lives, Class, Nation, and Queer Desire in Javier Fuentes' Countries of Origin. I grew up loving a country that didn't love me back. This first line of Javier Fuentes' 2023 Countries of Origin indexes nothing less than what its author calls the DNA of his debut novel. The United States had been my home since I was 8 years old, says Demetrio, Deme for short, the novel's undocumented first-person narrator, whose mother brought him from Spain to the U.S. when he was a child. For more than a decade, Deme says, I believed that a strong will would make things right. But a country can't love you back, and a strong will only gets you so far, he cautions. That a country cannot love you back, this is one of the keenest exigencies of American life, one ongoingly evidenced by the viciousness with which the second Trump administration is policing, interning, and terrorizing migrant communities and communities of color. ICE continues to detain many thousands of people in concentration camps, and ICE agents have murdered at least 13 people this year. These are the most recent violences to emerge in the long wake of the Homeland Security Act, whose 2002 passage and far-reaching consequences Countries of Origin traces and lambasts over the course of its narrative. Indeed, the tension between love and country is central to parsing what I locate as the novel's differently entangled realist commitments. On the one hand, I follow Patrick Nathan in identifying Countries of Origin as an especially powerful social novel. The simultaneous gift and burden of such a novel, Nathan writes, is to be both about and not about, to address a topical issue without reducing characters to symbols in service of an idea. Indeed, as both Raymond Williams and Terry Eagleton have suggested, realism's success often hinges on a novel's rendering of abstract issues and structural problems through, quote, closely observed situations peopled by convincingly drawn characters, end quote. As narrator, Deme certainly renders the quotidian realities and disidentifications of underclass precarity, precisely and vividly recounting what Nathan calls a life pushed into freefall. Moreover, Deme's incisive narratorial meta-commentary itself functions as a direct mode of social critique, a first-person declaration of the novel's ethical orientation toward those whose experience of contemporary life is cleaved by the embroidered violences of the nation-state. But on the other hand, I also want to probe what Phil Gambone has called the fairy tale ending of Countries of Origin, its too tidy deus ex machina resolution, its subsumption of class division through narrative closure. That is to say, I read Countries of Origin as a novel deeply committed to realist social critique of the US, of late capitalism, of homophobia, and at the same time as generically swerving into the differently realist register of the queer romance, at times even the rom-com. Of course, as critics have long pointed out, one of the great strengths of the realist novel, which Eagleton calls the most omnivorous in history, is its capacity to absorb, deploy, or otherwise rework the formal and narrative techniques of other genres. From the playful satire of Zadie Smith's White Teeth to Hanya Yanagihara's very polarizing naturalist fairy tale A Little Life, to the magical realist reimagination of movement in border fiction such as Mohsin Hamid's Exit West, plurality and pliancy are undeniable hallmarks of contemporary realism. I'm interested, however, in the queer and sometimes uneven ways that a novel might hold together different strands of realism, and I want to think through the affordances as well as the friction points of such formal simultaneity. By delineating two distinct and sometimes overlapping realist trajectories in Countries of Origin, then my point is to trace what each reveals about the space between love and country, and what their commingling illuminates about the relationship between class, queer desire, and transnational movement. At novel's open, Deme, a queer 20-something living in New York, works as a pastry chef at a French fine dining restaurant, where he earns low wages and feels himself to have no real chance for upward mobility. When a job as the head pastry chef at the Four Seasons becomes available, Deme finds himself in a double bind. On the one hand, the position would offer him greater economic security, enabling him to move up the ranks in the world of haute cuisine. But at the same time, he fears that the then-new Bush-era system of e-verification means that applying for the position will reveal his undocumented status, resulting not only in his not getting the job, but in his deportation from the US. This fear of exposure has been for Deme, quote, always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come back with renewed force. Indeed, ever since learning about his undocumented status when he was a tween, he has been fabricating possible scenarios that would grant him some kind of amnesty, an imaginative practice that he dismisses as fantasy, but which, we'll see, comes to take on significant force in the shifting realisms at work in countries of origin. Though he remains acutely aware that he exists within socioeconomic systems designed to prohibit his flourishing, Deme nevertheless feels compelled to try and peer beyond these delimitations. He applies for the job. His interviews go well, and as he gazes out at the city, Deme allows himself for a moment to feel hopeful. Hundreds of feet above ground, suspended in an ocean of flickering lights, it seemed that anything was possible, he tells us. Deme's perception of more capacious possibilities is crucial to the novel's social imaginary. What he feels himself to have fantasized about, his professional dreams and goals, are now within reach. They seem to have exited the realm of fantasy and on the verge of becoming reality. He is offered the job, he accepts the job. But, as Eve Sedgwick has observed, hope can be a fracturing thing to experience, and during the final part of the hiring process, Deme's undocumented status is revealed. In order to avoid a criminal record and to preserve a chance of return in the distant future, he learns that he must perform a voluntary departure from the US. Countries of Origin thus fords a social vision that toggles between Deme's experiences of hope and fear, fusing his first-person narration of precarity with his incisive critiques of the structural systems that have engineered such precarity. The novel's opening chapters establish the cruel freight of the national illogics that force Deme to go back to Spain, where he must enter a world about which he knows little and where he knows no one. From the outset, then, Fuentes' novel makes clear that it is about indicting the meta-narratives that underpin the U.S. imperial project, about deflating what Lauren Berlant has called the fantasies of sovereignty. Noting that much of the corpus of 20th century fiction centers on migrants moving to a different country, Fuentes has said that he wanted, with countries of origin, to think about the reverse journey, about those who are forced out of a country to which they had moved, or, in Deme's case, were brought. By focusing on this particular kind of exclusion, Fuentes intends to tell a different kind of story about the narrative trajectories of displacement, and I think a queer one. This comes to the fore perhaps most clearly during the scenes depicting Deme's voluntary departure, a legal mechanism that, as Nicholas Novy writes, insidiously relies upon the, quote, coerced consent of undocumented persons. Fuentes' novel decenters the optics of the state, however. My last steps on American soil happened without my noticing, unceremoniously, Deme tells us, after he boards the plane that will take him away from the US for at least a decade. Further, this extended sequence becomes, in the novel, something like an intrageneric interlude, marking Deme's movement into a differently tuned realism, that of the queer romance. His seatmate is a handsome Spaniard named Jacobo, who attends NYU, whose father is a business tycoon with ties to the conservative Partido Popular. His mother, Deme learns later, is a countess. But in his first moments with Jacobo, whose family and friends call him Jake, Deme finds himself experiencing a vague sense of hope, as well as the desire to be liked. He has, in short, a crush. And while Deme is at first unsure if Jacobo is flirting back, if he is queer, they bond quickly. They talk about Spanish politics, about Jacobo's family. Jake swipes a couple of mini bottles of Johnny Walker from the flight attendants. They get drunk. And after only 5 hours, Deme tells us, he has caught feelings for Jacobo. Love, like life, Fuentes has said in an interview, is all about timing. Fuentes' remark chimes with something that Williams and Eagleton observe about realism more broadly. that it emerges through the narrative enmeshment of contingency with necessity. What starts off as accidental, Eagleton suggests, may, within the ambit of a realist novel, end up as ineluctable. This, as Yiping Ong has argued, is central to the existential tension of the realist novel, especially those focused on courtship. We must both hold open the horizon of agency available to a novel's characters and to perceive them within the totalizing aesthetic frame of a novel as novel. In the space between the contingent and the necessary, between the accidental and the ineluctable, Fuentes maneuvers with extraordinary deftness a rather surprising generic slippage. What Jacobo calls Deme's voluntary-ish departure transforms into what will become, at the novel's end, a literally life-changing meet-cute. Upon their arrival in Madrid, Deme finds himself staying at Jacobo's family's palatial apartment. Jake, Deme notes, seems to enjoy his position of power in prolonging Deme's dependence on him. In need of his conservative father's approval, Jacobo remains semi-closeted. Consequently, Deme feels that his relationship with Jake is necessarily murky and ambiguous, charged with an undeniable erotic frisson and yet made perennially uncertain, again and again punted by Jacobo back into that realm of plausible deniability, platonic homosociality. Every time we were next to each other, Deme narrates, I felt an undertow pushing us closer. Every time one of us pulled away. But eventually the two start dating, and they do long distance when Jacobo has to return to New York for school. There he becomes close with Deme's uncle, and Deme likewise finds a confidant in Patricia, Jacobo's mother, who it is revealed very late in the novel is dying of cancer. In Deme's final visitation with her, Patricia tells him that life is too brief not to do what he wants, that he has a responsibility to himself to build a better life. To build a better life, this is in no small part a key aspect of the American dream, simultaneously readable as a vector of an individualizing cruel optimism, as well as the collective imaginative possibility required to transcend capitalist realism. This, then, is the naughty imbrication of realism that Fuentes' novel ultimately leads us to. For after Patricia's death, and after Jake seemingly ghosts him, lost in the throes of grief, Deme receives a call from a lawyer who informs him that Patricia has left him Las Brisas, a country estate. Delirious, Deme goes to the train station and travels there. Not long after he arrives, so does Jacobo. He informs Deme that Patricia had talked about this with him, that she had circumvented his father's homophobia because the estate was in her family. Deme tells Jake that he wants to turn the house into a dessert restaurant. He can, at long last, escape the wage labor what has so constrained him. In many ways, the ending echoes what critics locate as certain tendencies of 19th century novels. Karen Newman writes, for example, that in Jane Austen's fiction, the constant alternation between the fairy tale structure and materialist language works to solve a kind of gendered narrative problem, that of the independent woman. Obviously, Fuentes' novel differs from Austen's in key ways, and of course, Countries of Origin does not end literally in marriage. But it is nevertheless a novel whose realism largely emerges through what Deme's uncle earlier calls serendipity, or what we might think of as the queerly unforeseen play between contingency and necessity. I began with the novel's opening sentence, and here I want to turn to its concluding one. The next day, Deme wakes up before Jacobo. They spent the night together in Deme's new house, and he walks to the beach. There he gazes out at the horizon, glimpsing the coastline of Morocco in the distance. Quote, I imagined people across the ocean and all around the world embarking on new journeys, crossing borders and oceans and deserts, and dreaming of other lives, end quote. So how might we read this ending? On the one hand, we can read Deme's turning outward as a continuance of the social critique that propels so much of the novel. He thinks immediately of the fragility of his newfound position, of the preponderance of people who merely want to live better lives and dream desperately about them. We can read this promissory ending also as underscoring queerness is not yet here, the sense that futurity, because unbestowed, necessarily entails possibilities we might work to realize. But we can also think about the vantage from which Deme's expanded focalization emerges, a country estate conferred to him whose economic power utterly transforms his class identifications, sweeping him up into the world whose periphery he has haunted for much of the novel's duration. Deme no longer needs to dream of this life, for it has become his reality. To produce a conflict, a tension, a discordance, this is, for Karen Newman, enough to signal Jane Austen's simultaneous conservatism and revolutionary power. Fuentes' novel certainly produces, at least on my reading, a realist tension between love and country, only to resolve it at the last second. What, after all, are the odds that the mother of your plain seatmate will leave you a country estate that allows you to fulfill your personal and professional dreams? Not zero, but not super likely. Contingency and necessity, plausibility and probability, these are the shifting rubrics of realism that Fuentes' novel deploys iteratively and not always in neat alignment. Perhaps Countries of Origin's greatest offering to us is also its greatest point of generic friction. The idea that the life one dreams about could happen, but that such happening is, in many ways, beyond one's volition at both structural and interpersonal levels. Fuentes also shows us that the realist novel can be a useful, I think even vital, form for thinking queerly both about material realities as well as how they might be different than they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Our final speaker is Rylee Smith, who is a PhD candidate at University of Pennsylvania, so we know each other well, who was also on the organizing committee for Queer Class Relations and was the lead organizer of Queer Classroom that just happened at Penn. So thanks for your work, Rylee, and come on up.
Thanks, Heather. I'm going to cite you later, so cover your ears. This paper unfolds in 3 parts. Part 1, The Giver. This paper, unsurprisingly, starts with a song. But no, I won't sing for you. You're safe. Last spring, Chapel Roan released a one-off single called The Giver, which debuted at #1 on Billboard's Hot Country charts. In it, Roan makes the case for her superior sexual talents which are so natural as to need no adornment in the typical markers of country music masculinity. She doesn't need antlers hanging on her walls or a noisy lifted truck to satisfy her woman, because she's a giver. And unlike the country boy quitters skewered in the lyrics, she gets the job done. In fact, she gets the job done 9 times over the track's 3-minute run. The end of the song's second verse really drives home the guiding metaphor. In this strip mall town of dreams, Roan sings, the song's addressee would be hard-pressed to find a man with the means to rhinestone cowgirl all night long. Simply put, a world of potent and active lesbian femme desire is inaugurated through the singer's suggestion of her superior status as both a lover and an earner. She has the means. Thus, Roan positions herself as a conduit not only of sexual, but of a kind of class fulfillment. She gets the job done, in love and in work, which in the world of the song are nearly one and the same. The narrative Roan constructs through devices like the tongue-in-cheek euphemism of the job, the image of the strip mall town, the longing for fulfillment across registers, strikes me as familiar as country, a genre marked in content by themes of love and loss and work, and informed by a kind of winking wordplay. Often written off for its literalism, simplicity, and narrative bent, country music appears in this paper as a genre that, as Nadine Hubbs writes in Queers, Rednecks, and Country Music, quote, directs its appeals to fantasy and imagination, as well as selected perceptions of reality. It thus offers its listeners a space for both reckoning with the conditions under which they may live and imagining possibilities for how things could be different. I turn to country music as a genre through which love and work, desire and class cause friction as they bump into each other in ways that I think are worth attending to when we think about a queer class framework. Now, The Giver is squarely in line with a long history of queer country camp, but I also want to be clear about the earnest investment here. It isn't a parody that uses a sort of dissonance of lesbian desire in a hostile form to level a critique of the genre as retrograde or low class. In an interview right after the song released, Roan says that it actually comes out of her own changing relationship to her Missouri childhood and her queerness, allowing her to transform the shame she had as a closeted gay kid into a raunchy country romp. For Chapel Roan and for me as a listener, country music stages a reckoning with the cultural codes that she and I both grew up with as white kids from the Midwest. That sticky class habitus that no amount of moving out or moving up can really shake. Part 2, The Listener. On the back cover of my copy of Dorothy Allison's novel, Bastard Out of Carolina, the blurb describes the novel as, quote, written in a mesmerizing voice that mingles the languid rhythms of country music with raw, unsparing descriptions of violence, end quote. Though treated as a component of Allison's literary style, I don't think enough has been made of country music as like the ubiquitous cultural form that appears in the pages of the novel. For much of the book, country music emerges as part of the texture, to use a word that pops up in Hubbs's book, of Bones' life. A record or the radio is always on in the background. In some of the most harrowing moments of violence, Bones' perspective will drift to the music, flagging a singer like Kitty Wells as Mama's favorite, a mechanism of dissociation or distancing. Here, I want to think with Allison about the matters of love, work, and country music in 2 moments. First, Bones' experience of the gospel circuit, and second, in Bones' own longing to herself become transformed into a country singer. About halfway through the book, Bone becomes friends with Shannon, whose parents manage a circuit of touring gospel acts. In the novel, which takes place in the 1950s in South Carolina, gospel and country music are nearly inseparable from one another. Bone even says of the circuit that the singers moved back and forth on it, a tide of gilt and fringed jackets that paralleled and intersected the country western circuit. Sometimes you couldn't tell the difference, and as times got harder, certainly Mr. Pearl stopped making distinctions, booking any act that would get him a little cash up front, end quote. Here, we see another angle of the relationship between these cultural forms and work, that is, in their circulation as commodities dictated by a market. The genres blur as the Pearls become more desperate to maintain their status, precariously perched just above Bone. Thus, we get a picture of the conditions of country music production that feed into Bone's fantasy of upward mobility via the Opry star. The relationship of this music scene to capital comes to a head when Bone and Shannon encounter a black church choir singing. "You hear that?" Bone says. "We gotta tell your daddy." This sets Shannon off on a racist tirade, noting that her father doesn't handle black singers because there isn't any money in it. And Bone's suggestion exposes her own white trash status, placing her beneath the consideration of the Pearl family. The love and the desire is also at play in these moments between Bone and Shannon. Bone tells the reader that going on tour with the Pearls was enough to stop me worrying about my fascination with Shannon. I could easily credit the whole enterprise to my odd but acceptable lust for the music. Thus, the music gives a kind of cover, a way to channel unsettling feelings toward perhaps a more acceptable object. The choice of the word lust here feels important. The music, caught up in capitalist circulation and this sort of structural racism of the South and this inappropriate eroticism, emerges as a crucial nexus for these ferryings between race, class, evangelical Christianity, and desire, between artistic representation, the market producing it, and the people consuming it. The attachment to Bone's mother is also central here, an attachment fostered by their shared listening to the Kitty Wells and Patsy Cline songs that fill the novel. And the novel ends with a Patsy Cline song taking on the sound of the accents of Bone's family members in the very moment that her mother comes to say goodbye. Around this time in the novel, Bone becomes obsessed with actually becoming a singer through her listening, even though, much to her own dismay, she can't sing a note. This fantasy of becoming a singer indexes a connection between the longing for emotional and physical security, love even, and class mobility. Listening to the jukebox in a cafe full of truckers, Bone says, "I'd sit out under the cafe windows and hum along with those twangy girl voices, imagining myself crooning those raw and desperate notes. Everybody knew that Opry stars started as gospel singers. Half asleep in the sun, I'd make promises to God. If only he'd let me be a singer. I knew I'd probably turn to whiskey and rock and roll like they all did, but not for years, I promised. Not for years, Lord. Not till I had glorified his name and bought Mama a yellow Cadillac and a house on Old Henderson Road." Clearly, the thought of becoming a singer opens the door for a whole world of fantasy in which Bone can think about getting out, can potentially see a way out. She knows these people. She's on tour with the Pearls. And also to imagine a route through which she can, save her mother. This doesn't work, obviously. We see this sort of dynamic again in a later scene when Bone again bargains with God. "If he'd take bastards into heaven, how come he wouldn't put me in front of those hot lights and all that dispensation? Gospel singers always had money in their pockets, another bottle under their seats. They had love and safety and the whole wide world to fall back on. All I wanted," I whispered, "all I wanted was a little piece of it." Love and safety, money in their pockets, and another bottle under their seats. The raw hunger Allison conveys for something else is routed through this familiar but also distant figure of the singer, and listening to the music becomes a way to sort of direct these feelings. So to take Allison seriously is to take seriously this cultural form, country music, as productive of Bone's subjectivity. Part 3, the line dancer. Has anyone else noticed that all the hot city queers are line dancing again? In actuality, we never stopped, but I have noticed a dramatic uptick in enthusiasm for, and internet friends participating in, queer line dancing parties like Stud Country. So much so that this particular center of encounter between queers and country music has been featured in a segment on the Today Show, in which they teach the hosts how to line dance, written up in the New York Times, and even had a short documentary produced by the LA Times about it. In this documentary, 2 competing discourses emerge about the meaning of line dancing in the community that has formed around it over the last 50 years in Los Angeles. One young dancer says that, quote, "Growing up in the South as a gay teen, I sort of rejected country music. These guys that bullied me were the guys that were listening to it. It has been nice to sort of reclaim my space, reclaim a part of my identity." This is the sort of identity-based reclamation narrative, much like the one Chappell Roan tells about writing The Giver. Another of the dancers in Stud Country gives a more universalizing account, saying, "I think it reminds people of their humanity, and if we don't agree, we can share a dance, if just that." I'm not sure if I buy into either of these explanations. They both seem to have problems. But I am really interested in how they work and the sort of mechanics. Whenever I hear about line dancing, it makes me think of my mother, who, when I was a little kid, used to go out dancing on Thursday nights at a honky-tonk called Bucky's, outside of Cleveland, Ohio. Thursday night was ladies' night, and she was there for the ladies. I still wear the cologne that I remember smelling on her when she would come home and kiss me goodnight. It's Eternity by Calvin Klein. But this memory is entirely wrapped up in another one, to the point where I have a hard time drawing a line between them. My mom, again, coming home late, this time from work, smelling not of cologne but of grease, the mood not celebratory, but exhausted. Country music, Hubbs writes, is a flashpoint. Country songs take part in cultural dialogues that both produce and push against class and status, gender and sexuality, race and ethnicity. The songs are all about the minutia of living in conditions of economic deprivation and emotional wounding. They're all about, like, my cheating husband, he left me for, whatever. So if part of the bid for a queer class framework, then, is to reckon with the need, to quote Heather Love, to make do and get by, the queer refusal of the choice between capitulation and revolution, country music is one place to look for these narratives that are all about the entanglement of sexual, gender, and other forms of desire with these longings for mobility. And much like the text that Love cites as inspirations for her thinking, country music too allows us to think about the ambivalences of, quote, the shame of being an outsider and the shame of becoming an insider. Thank you.
Okay, we have about like 12 minutes or so for questions, so there are mics, and they're at your service, these guys. So anybody have any questions? Yes, all right, excellent.
Thank you so much to all of you. Rylee, I'm going to ask you to read that quote from Heather Love again about capitulation and revolution. And what I'm wondering is, I kept thinking about Polemic when you were talking about country music. And I was wondering if you and S could maybe talk about the intersections of Polemic and country music and the way that you might formulate it across your two projects.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, cool. Yeah, country music is about polemicizing entirely. The Chapel Roan song is a polemic. It's like, here's my lesbian sex song that's, all wrapped up in these markers that, we traditionally write off. Yeah, and the quote from Heather is from a roundtable on materialism and crisis from, I think, 2012. And she says, like, she's more interested in making do and getting by in a room with, Marxists, and is interested in these texts that really get at the sort of lived realities, the textures of being queer and being poor. And that what's queer about them is the refusal of the choice of capitulation or revolution. Sort of neither nor there. Do you have anything to say about polemics?
Well, yeah, I have nothing to say about country music because I'm not from this country, and I can't pretend to understand them. And I've been to stud country, and I was facing the wrong direction the whole time.
That's very queer.
Yeah, it was intentional. But yeah, I think Laura asks a really good and interesting question, and something I kind of pointed to, which is the fact that I don't think Polemic is limited to text, and there's so much to be said about performance and like Chapel Roan's drag in her performance and the way that she's playing with this genre that obviously has associations with which one would maybe assume she wouldn't want to play with, and of course she does.
And I think, too, that polemicizing for, like, marginalized subjects can be a way of, like, claiming a bravado, a dignity of, like, here I am, here's what I have to say. And that shares a lot with country music, I think, too.
Yeah, I think another crossover point, something I didn't quite get to, is that with Polemic, something that is so crucial when, you're thinking about class is, like, lesbian feminist publishing and like the cultures and communities that kind of adhere around the creation of like cultural means of production. And obviously country music kind of has come to be associated with a kind of corporate soulless country, but there are these kind of underclass roots of the genre that I think queer people are self-consciously trying to re-engage with in both cases. So, great question. Thank you.
Maybe, can I ask a question, sort of to all the panel, but I was just, the topic is class and desire and intimacy, and I guess I was thinking about fantasy, and on the one hand we can think about these sort of fantasies, the queer romance, right, the fantasy of like amazing upward mobility and love going together, right? But there's also the example of Cologne in Greece, or of the eroticization of working class masculinity, right? And there's a way in which fantasy and desire are totally bound up with class, but not in the sense of upward mobility. It's, it can be sort of just being where you are, or it can be actually, whatever, there's narratives of slumming, downward mobility, desire for working class fetishization, et cetera, et cetera. So is that worth thinking about, the sort of polarity there around mobility and desire? Anybody who wants to answer it?
I guess I can go, I'm sorry, not to take up too much space, but I think something that I'm very interested in is, given the indeterminacy, the political unwieldiness of desire and of fantasy, I think something that I'm really interested about in Polemic is the way in which it can kind of shake fantasy loose. And, there's no guarantee that, a fantasy that replaces what is shaken loose is better or good or desirable in the other sense of the word at all. But I'm nonetheless fascinated with that friction and that potential for movement. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking too, while you were asking the question, Heather, about this sort of novel that's buried in countries of origin, but that doesn't actually unfold, which is this whole network of attachments that the protagonist has to leave behind in New York, right? And so it's sort of, you get a glimpse of what his life would have looked like had this sort of fantastical, like swooning romance not occurred, and I think it's a very different kind of novel. And I was also thinking of Swimming in the Dark, a novel by Tomasz Drzeżowski that's set in Poland in the 1950s, 60s, and is sort of all about the way that desire is both illicit and it sort of sends you into different economic paths. So it's about sort of someone who becomes a high-ranking government official and someone who wants to be an academic but is strictured, right, by the financial need not to. So I think that's a really good question and something that exists in tandem with these kind of grander, happy ending narratives.
In terms of my paper, this was definitely something I was thinking about a lot. I think in the sort of, because like the wider framing of this paper, I was thinking about the mistress-maid dynamic as it appears in like 18th and 19th century British fiction. And there's a scholar, Kirsty Bohatter, who's written a lot about the sort of erotics of this and how it's sort of like this relationship which the flow of power is, you'd think it'd be like static, but it's not. It's kind of like in this ever-changing like matrix from mistress to maid. And that's sort of like how the erotics of the relationship are like emerging. And I think it's sort of the same thing is happening here in this like cross-class relationship between Beebo and Laura, where there's really no like upwardness for them, and they're sort of like in this space where that's like fundamentally sort of not going to happen, but yet the erotic is sort of emerging from being like outside of this space in a way, I think.
Mm-hmm. Are there other questions? We just had Justin Torres, the novelist Justin Torres at Penn, and he was talking about the erotics of working class masculinity and saying that it had something in his mind to do with the riskiness of working class work and sort of violence and danger. So, I think it's interesting also, like, how do we think about desire itself? Is it desire for security and being held and safety, or is it desire for risk? And, I guess that would be one way to read that. I mean, you could definitely do a sort of, we're past queer now reading of that final line, right? Which is like, oh, it's so great, just like cross boundaries, it's awesome, right? And you can see the limits of that. But also, is it really like the story foretold of like all of the hardship that is actually part of the desire? I mean, I think that's part of the question. What do people want? But yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, because I read the novel twice, because the first time I was like, what's going on? I got about halfway through and I was like, we've switched into a different kind of story, which I found very disarming. And then at the end, it seemed almost like the novel was trying to kind of loop back to this sense of social critique, but I don't think it lands all the way right, because it is sort of coming from this insular place, this point of sort of extreme newfound wealth, and it's sort of looking out at the horizon of possibility that is, of course, extraordinarily difficult, right? And so, yeah, I think it doesn't fully land, but I think it's trying to do both at once, which is interesting, but, aesthetically, politically problematic.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're good. Let's thank the speakers, please.